Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some. Thank you so much for joining our 75-minute webinar today. This is an Investor Alliance webinar on that's entitled Unjust Transition, Uyghur Forced Labor in the Global Solar Supply Chain. My name is Anita Dorret, and I'm the Director with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and Initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR. Before we start, I wanted to just take a few moments to honor the legacy of Professor John Ruggie, the professor in Human Rights and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and author of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, who sadly passed away on September 16. In crafting the UN Guiding Principles, Professor Ruggie forever changed how companies and their investors identified, mitigated, and remedied human rights risks in global supply chains, leaving a lasting legacy that will impact the lives of millions. The Investor Alliance will work to deeply embed the responsibility to respect human rights through the uptake of the UNGPs into the core of businesses and investment decision-making, continuing Professor Ruggie's remarkable contribution and legacy. The Investor Alliance is a coalition of global institutional investors. We have more than 200 members across 18 countries, representing over 6 trillion in asset under management. Our members include asset managers, asset owners, public and private pension funds, trade union funds, faith-based organizations, foundations, and family funds. For those less familiar with us, the Investor Alliance's goal is to provide a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights. And we do this in one of 3 ways. First, to promote the investor's responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct for institutional investors. We do this through capacity building activities like this webinar, as well as through the development of practical tools and guidance like the Investor Practical Guidance on Human Rights Crisis in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which we launched last year. Second, through corporate engagement, where we activate a broad base of investors to take a coordinated approach to engagement with companies on their responsibility to respect human rights. We do this in close coordination with civil society and experts in the area. And we'll be meeting some of those experts on the line today. The third is on standard setting, where we engage with policymakers and standard setting bodies to advocate for the creating of enabling environments, a level playing field for responsible business conduct. And we've done a fair bit on that in relation to the human rights crisis in the Uyghur region. We'll hear a little bit more about that as we get into our webinar proper. Just a few quick logistic points before we get started. The first, as you will know by now, is that we're recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available to all registrants shortly hereafter. The second is that all of the attendees are muted at this time, but you will have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. You can do this by typing your question into the question and answer box, and we'll read this out during the Q&A session, or you can virtually raise your hands, and we will try our very best to unclick and unmute you so that you can share your question when we open up for our question and answer session. So now on to the content of this webinar. As governments, civil society, and businesses around the world are working to meet sustainability goals and to combat climate change, investors have channeled more than 300 billion last year in investments to support the global transition to clean energy, with the highest investment in the solar energy. However, a recent report from Sheffield Hallam University, Helena Kennedy Center, entitled In Broad Daylight, revealed the extensive use of forced labor from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which I'll refer to as the Uyghur Region, in the global supply chain. Next slide, please. The human rights crisis in the Uyghur region relates to more than 1.8 million Uyghurs, Turkic, and Muslim majority peoples that have been subject to extrajudicial detention in internment camps, prisons, and factories. This detention underpins a system of repression in which business enterprises are involved. There is widespread forced labor of people in and from the Uyghur region who have been made to work in factories across China as part of the global supply chain, and mass surveillance of people in and from the Uyghur region through the use of technology developed and sold by technology companies. An estimated 45% of the world's polysilicon supply, the core component in solar panel production, originates from the Uyghur region, while 35% comes from other regions in China. So with China's dominance in controlling around 80% of the world's solar supply chain, Uyghur forced labor is pervasive throughout stages of solar panel production, from mining of quartz to solar module assembly. The report also uncovers the damaging environmental impacts of solar panel production in the Uyghur region, as factories burn an enormous amount of coal in order to create polysilicon for solar panels. Heavy coal subsidies from the government accounts for China's near monopoly of solar panel production by undercutting solar industries around the world. Next slide, please. Global companies across multiple sectors, including the solar sectors, have operations, investments, partnerships, and other business relationships in the Uyghur region, as well as in other parts of China. The violation of one human right is often connected to the violation of other human rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For example, the surveillance of ethnic minorities is a violation of their rights to privacy, and the personal information gathered is used to restrict their freedom of movement and, in numerous instances, to extrajudicially detain them. Detained Uyghurs and other Muslim majority peoples are prohibited from exercising their right to religious freedom. Those forced to work in factories are separated from their families, and children are housed in institutions away from their parents. Given the repression and the surveillance perpetrated by the Chinese government, operating in the Uyghur region in accordance with the UN guiding principles for business and human rights is a practical impossibility. As investors, we are directly linked to these egregious human rights violations through our investments in solar companies who are conducting businesses directly through business relationships connected to the Uyghur region, through supplies with factories or working with supply of solar modules, or working with factories that have Uyghur forced labor in their supply chain. Governments and businesses, including investors, need to ensure that there is a just transition to renewable energy that doesn't come at the cost and expense of people and planet. Next slide, please. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights published an investor guidance document to inform investors of these salient human rights risks associated with business activities of their portfolio companies in or connected with the Uyghur region. The guidance provides tools and suggestions to investors on how to engage with their portfolio companies to identify, prevent, and mitigate these risks, and where that is not possible, to consider divestment. In parallel with engagement with our portfolio companies, investors also have a responsibility to use their leverage to collaborate with other investors and civil societies stakeholders like Uyghur Human Rights Group, as well as international organizations and policymakers to stop, prevent, and mitigate these abuses. The goal of today's webinar is for investors to be informed of the scale and nature of Uyghur forced labor in the solar supply chain, understand the connection of solar companies that they are invested in to these abuses, and the implications in light of new regulations and government responses on these issues. We want to discuss what steps investors should consider taking individually or collectively, and we're also going to have a discussion of what other steps that other financial actors are beginning to take in response. So with this, to take us through the discussion, and next slide, please. We have an amazing panel of experts today. Thank you. We have Nairola Ilima, who is a supply chain analyst and researcher at the Helena Kennedy Center on Forced Labor Lab at the Sheffield Hallam University. As a consultant, She provides research on Chinese corporate structures, supply chain mapping, and ESG risk assessment to scholars, investment firms, and international media organizations. Nairola is ethnic Uyghur and was born in the Uyghur region and moved to Sweden in 2011, where she now lives and is a citizen. We're also very fortunate to have Professor Laura Murphy, a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice at the Sheffield Hallam University. She's the author of books as well as academic articles on forced labor. She has consulted for the World Health Organization and the US government, including the US Office of Victims of Crime. She has provided expert evidence briefs regarding the situation in the Uyghur region for the UK and Australian governments, and she spent a significant time as well in the Uyghur region between 2004 and 2005. Nairola and Laura are the co-authors of the report on forced labor in the solar supply chain in broad daylight, and they will be taking us through that. We have two other great panelists, but I will pause now to take time to introduce you at a later stage, and really wanted to hand you over to Nairola to kick us off so that we can start to understand more about what we've come to learn here at the webinar. So next slide, please. Nairola.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this engaging with us on this important topic. And so, as Anita has been introduced, I and Laura Murphy has published a report recently. It is about the solar supply chains. Next slide, please. So for the last few years, the internment camps have emerged across the entire Uyghur region. There has been approximately 1.8 million people were detained, and my cousin Mayra Yaqub was one of them. Under the international pressure, Chinese government claimed that a lot of the student has been graduated, but this is not the reality. Our report documents that China has placed 1 million of the Uyghur and Kazakh from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region into what the government calls surplus labor and the labor transfer programs. The Chinese government claimed that the workers in this program are engaged voluntarily. However, the evidence that driven directly from the government and company source reveals that the labor transfer are participate in Xinjiang with an environment of coercion by the constant threat of re-education and internment camp. The forced labor can happen in different ways in Xinjiang. Some of them are within the internment camps, and some will be happened as a condition of the release. And some of them will be like just in front of your doors. They will open satellite factories. And as you may also see in the news, a lot of Uyghur has been transferred to across the Uyghur region, and some of them has been transferred outside the Uyghur region. Next, please. So when we traced supply chains all the way back to its very early source, we usually will look at are they engaging labor transfers? Are these workers under a constant threat that they would be sending to the camp? Did workers lose their land? Did workers leave their parents and kids behind? Are they allowed to have some private time? Are they subject to strict controls and constant surveillance? Next slide, please. The evidence we found, usually we will use the evidence from the local news, government propaganda, articles, or government directives, and a company source such as their own CSR report or annual report. And in this document, we usually will find out that the government and companies are celebrated how they have been successfully changed the Uyghur ideology through the labor vocational training and patriotic education, how the government has won the ideological combat with the help of the education, patriotic education, or with labor. For example, after the work, you will see these Uyghur workers, Kazakh workers must participate in some patriotic education, sing the communist song, and recite some Xi Jinping thought. Then, according to the government propaganda, you usually will see, because they worked so hard on this worker, then this a lazy, radical, stubborn Uyghur worker suddenly become a modern citizen. And this worker is so grateful for the government and the party that has saved his life or her life from the extremist ideologies. Next, please. And we will also to look at our government officers or recruiters will go into house to house to keep asking Uyghur people, Kazakh people to leave. So the government can assign them to a labor program. In some regions, the government agents or labor recruiters will assign each Uyghur or Kazakh into a point value. The point system will decide how far this person's workplace will be from their home. Those need to be the control are sent for training, all others are sent to the work, either close to home or across the country. Next, please. And we will also look at I think there's something wrong with my slide, but anyway, are they co-located? We usually will look at every site we could to try to see if they're near to or co-located with a camp or any kind of the. There's something wrong with my slide. Maybe can we change
Juliet, just
slide?
click through a bunch more. It's piece by piece. It's animated.
Thank you. This slide should be for the last one. Yeah, this is the slide I used for my what I was talking before. And then Julia, please next slide. Are they co-located? We usually will look at every site. We could try to see if they are near or co-located with camp or any kind of the detention facility, such as a pre-jail or hardcore prison. And last one, we will see what is the engagement with the Xinjiang production and a construction corps, XPCC. Next slide, please. So here's the example I want to use is a solar module company, the Jinko. So Jinko established a subsidiary in Xinjiang in 2016. At that time, just a mass internment campaign against the Uyghur and Kazakh and other ethnic minorities was beginning. So we use this historical satellite image from the Google Earth. We can see as Jinko, at the same time as Jinko Silicon facility were built, the prison and detention center will also be built in the same industry park. And you can see it's just merely 1.5 miles away. But we're not saying that the internment camp or prison provide the labor for the Jinko Solar, but because some company co-located in the industry park with camp, they have used the forced labor of the detainees from the internment camp or prison. So the Jinko Solar co-location can represent as a huge risk. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nirula, for giving us that background, really in depth on how we do our research and the kinds of things that we're looking for when we're talking about forced labor. Can you get the next slide? What we did in our report was to identify the companies that were operating in China, in particular in Xinjiang, and to ask some of those questions that Nirula just pointed to regarding whether or not they were engaged in labor transfers, which, as she said, because they're operating on this background of coercion and the threat of going to internment camps, are understood to be forced labor inherently, because no one can choose not to join one of these labor transfer programs. So there may be some people who would choose to be transferred for work in the Xinjiang region, but unlike in other parts of China, people in the Uyghur region can't choose not to go, because to choose not to go would be to be deemed radical and then potentially likely to be sent to a camp. To resist a government directive is itself now illegal and therefore and punishable by internment or imprisonment. And so we would look for these signs of forced labor. We look for signs of engagement with the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is a paramilitary conglomerate that is responsible for a lot of oppression in the region. We looked for co-location of camps, just as she said, and we tried to identify where that might be happening in the solar supply chain, if at all. Next slide. So we looked in particular for the ILO indicators of forced labor, and I will tell you at the outset that we identified at least at least four within solar supply chains. Abuse of vulnerability, which is transparent from their being vulnerable to the internment camps, but also many of the people who are being transferred are themselves deeply impoverished. Deception, people are told they're going to be paid, but then they're not. They're told they're going to be able to come and go, but they're not. And of course, restriction of movement. People go to these jobs and they're not allowed to leave. And when they do leave, they're often accompanied by a monitor or a guard. And also isolation. Many of the companies that we're talking about today who operate within the solar supply chain operate in very distant, isolated areas. And even for their Han workers, they provide support because they are so isolated. They host events and parties and celebrations and things like that to make sure that people remain sane living out in the vast desert. But for the workers that are brought in through these labor transfer programs, they are incredibly isolated, but they are also unable to connect or communicate with their family members, live with their families, take care of their family, their land. They're isolated from their culture and their religion. And so there's an extraordinary amount of isolation as well. These other ILO indicators are likely also in effect there, but we didn't identify them with the particular companies we looked at within the solar supply chain. Next slide. So as Anita mentioned earlier, 45% of the world's polysilicon, which is a major component of solar modules, 45% of it is made in the Uyghur region, 30% is made in the rest of China. That other 30% is important because while polysilicon is one of the major components of a solar module, it is 95% of the world's solar module. 5% of them are made with a different technology entirely, but the vast majority of them are made with polysilicon. And polysilicon for the solar energy industry has been understood sort of metaphorically, not in reality, but they're kind of said to be a raw material, the earliest material in the supply chain. But of course it is not. It is made of what's called metallurgical grade silicon, which is itself made of quartz, which is a raw material. It does come out of the ground. So most of the companies that people were looking at in Xinjiang, companies in the Uyghur region, were making polysilicon, but others are mining those raw materials in Xinjiang and making metallurgical grade silicon, which go into polysilicon. So this is important because that other 30% of China's polysilicon production much of it is being fed by the metallurgical grade silicon and quartz being mined in Xinjiang. That is also true for some of the other 25% that's being produced in the rest of the world. Some of them are also sourcing from Xinjiang. So even for companies at the ingot stage or people at the companies at the module stage who are not necessarily purchasing their polysilicon from Xinjiang, they could be purchasing from some other company that is purchasing metallurgical grade silicon or quartz from Xinjiang. So this is incredibly important. In a way, the Chinese government has created an incentives program that has cornered the market for the solar energy industry in terms of the polysilicon and in the terms of the silica precursor. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, what we did was we decided to look very carefully at companies that operate in Xinjiang in particular to see if they had any of these signs of forced labor. We looked at 12 companies working in the quartz and metallurgical grade silicon industry. We looked at 6 companies in polysilicon, and we looked at 10 companies that are typically vertically integrated from ingots to modules or work in some segment of that end production. Some of those companies are located in Xinjiang, others are located outside of Xinjiang, but we wanted to see at that stage in module production, were they purchasing from Xinjiang? So, oh, I keep trying to click for the next slide. Next slide. So we found, and I'll show you in a minute, all of the companies that we found to be engaged in this work. But one of the things we found was that Hoshine, which is a company that creates metallurgical grade silicon at that very earliest stage in module production, they were engaged in some serious forced labor programs and very much celebratory about it, as Nirala said. Next slide. For instance, they were, this is one family whose story was told in a Chinese social media campaign. They're the Ahmadines. These were folks who did not want to take a labor transfer. People came to their house, labor agents came every day saying, you need to go, you need to go, you need to go. But they resisted. They said, we have parents who are too old for us to abandon. We have land that we are farming and we don't want to abandon it. We have a life here. We don't have the skills. And the labor agents that were assigned by the government to go to the Ahmadine's house came in and liberated them from their problems, unburdened them is the kind of language we hear. And what they did was they said, okay, well, we're going to take care of your grandparents and parents. Your companies and cities and counties have been building elder care facilities and orphanages because there are so many parents and children, you know, people, grown people having to be displaced, that old people and young people, children, are being abandoned and they're having to live in elder care facilities and orphanages. So they say, okay, we've taken care of your parents. We're going to give you training so you know how to do this industrial work. And we are going to liberate you from your land by transferring it to a cooperative so you don't have to worry about that land anymore. Next slide. So many families like the Ahmadines are being forced to go out into this deep desert area to work in this extraordinarily isolated and labor intensive area where Hoshine is making their metallurgical grade silicon. You can see here, this red square is what you're seeing here. And if we go to the next slide, you're going to see down here in this area, next slide, is where they're sourcing their quartz. This area is a place where we were able to identify not one, but two extrajudicial detention centers. And if you'll see in the next slide, you'll see that these detention centers in this area where they're mining their quartz has double perimeter fencing. It has like exercise yards outside the dormitories. It has many of the signs like double guard gates and hard entrance into the area. These are some of the signs of detention centers that people are using for satellite imagery. And we were able to identify these in the place where Hoshine was sourcing their materials. So it's very possible, it's high risk of forced labor there. And then we know that they're engaged in these labor transfer programs. Next slide. Let's skip this one. They're also engaged with the XPCC. We did this kind of research for 30 companies or so, as I said, and we found that 6 raw materials companies operating in Xinjiang were engaged in these labor transfer programs, that 3 polysilicon companies were, and that 2 probably were engaged in labor transfers that were doing the ingots to modules. And those 2 companies are very important players in the solar module industry. Trina may not still be in operation in Xinjiang, so we're not sure. Next slide. What this means for the solar supply chain is pretty dire, because if we look just at Hoshine's supply chain, Hoshine sells to Daco, which is a company that we could not, does operate in Xinjiang, but we could not find much of a trace of any labor transfer engagement. However, because Daco is supplied by Hoshine and Hoshine is so deeply involved in labor transfer, that affects all of Daco's own customers, which include the 4 most prominent module manufacturers in the world. And so we're talking about a supply chain that is very much pervasively tainted by forced labor. Next slide. I can see that I'm out of time. So I want to just end with a couple of things.
Just keep going. You know, a couple more minutes is fine, Laura. Please keep going.
Okay, because I do want to cover like what's happened in response.
Yes, please.
So, and you can see if we even look at one of Daco's customers, Jinko, and their customers, then we're looking at a global reach of this tainted supply. Can we go to the next slide? So I want to talk about what's happened in response to this. Before my report came out, before any reports came out about the solar industry's investments in Xinjiang, the Solar Energy Industry Association came out in front and said, we recognize that we have a lot of companies that are supplying us, that are operating in the Xinjiang region. We are going to create, we want to get ahead of this. We want to create a protocol to help us identify forced labor in our supply chains and do better on our due diligence. They created the SIA created a forced labor prevention pledge in which 275 companies pledged to abhor forced labor. I hope we all abhor forced labor. But then they also said that they would be out of Xinjiang by July. Then our report came out. Next slide, please. And what happened was that the US government did not do exactly what the solar energy industry expected. They expected the East Hope, oh, I've got a typo there. I'm so sorry. It says Easy Hope, but it's East Hope, GCL, and the polysilicon companies would probably get in trouble based on their engagement with these forced labor programs. DACO had a big show explaining how they were not engaged in forced labor, had a lot of media come out to their company to show them that they not only didn't have forced labor, but they effectively did not hire Uyghur workers, which to my mind is a kind of racism that is also a problem. However, what the solar energy industry did not anticipate was information about the precursors to polysilicon. They have discussed at length that they had never considered metallurgical grade silicon, or where it was produced, or how it was produced. And so when the US government put a withhold release order on Hoshine, the producer of metallurgical grade silicon, this came as a surprise to most people. That withhold release order meant that no one could purchase anything, no one in the United States could import anything made in whole or in part with a product made by Hoshine. That covers a vast deal of polysilicon, as I've mentioned, but also a ton of other silica products, including things that are adhesives, certain kinds of rubbers. I don't understand the rest of the silicon industry, I'll be honest. But it was a huge problem it is a huge problem for the silicon industry. They also announced a bunch of companies on an entities list, which means we can't share technology with them or sell anything to them, which is also troubling. And I can answer more questions about that later. And not troubling ethically, but troubling, practically for businesses. So let's go to the next slide. I'm almost done. This surprise for the solar energy industry has led them to sort of back down from their promises to get out of Xinjiang. They're clearly not out of Xinjiang by July, as they had promised. They have been asking for some lenience in the enforcement of this law, which is a law that's been in effect since 1930, but the WRO only in the last few months. And their basic ask is, look at polysilicon, see that we've gotten out of polysilicon, and give us a pass on Hoshine, even though that's the company that has been the subject of the WRO. And they're saying that they've been caught flat-footed. Some solar industry experts are saying that they've been caught flat-footed, but of course they were the ones who alerted me that there was a problem in the solar supply chain and much of the rest of the world. And they certainly knew that metallurgical grade silicon was an ingredient in polysilicon, because they are the people who do quality control to ensure that the purity of their product is there. So they know that there are ingredients in polysilicon. So now they're trying to slow down this process of enforcement. Next slide. It seems to me that to be in line with an ethical stance on state-sponsored forced labor, companies should engage the Coalition to Enforce Labor in the Uyghur Region's call to action, which asks them to end all contracts with any suppliers that own a subsidiary facility or mine in Xinjiang, or are a subsidiary of a parent company that owns a subsidiary in the region. A little bit complicated, but get out of Xinjiang, period. and seesaw relationships with companies that are being supplied in any way by companies operating in Xinjiang. I believe both these things are necessary in order for us to have the economic impact we need to use our economic leverage to stop this massive human rights crisis. Next slide, which is the last slide. I also think that one of the ways we can do this is to invest in alternatives to that supply chain. It takes some time for that to build up. There are alternatives that exist now, but part of that investment can be in expanding the capacity of already established companies that are working in that supply chain or on alternative technologies like thin film technology. We can be looking at the development of new manufacturing facilities outside of China. I know that India is working on this, Malaysia as well. And then government and development investment banks can use their green infrastructure investments to invest in this expansion. And so I'd like to see much more of a focus on what we can do for the future now that we know just how dire the situation is in China. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura and Narola, for giving us all that information. I mean, that information was really important to kind of lay the groundwork so that we understand the supply chains and we understand how this really impacts our investment portfolio. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our investor panelist, Reggie Smith, who will provide us some insights on the thinking of investors on this issue. Reggie is a research analyst for Eventide Asset Management, a $9 billion values-based investment firm in Boston. He's primarily responsible for evaluating and monitoring new and existing clean energy investment opportunities. Prior to Eventide, Reggie spent 5 years at Johnson Controls, where he developed large energy conservation and solar projects. And he holds a MBA at Harvard Business School. And, you know, we're very glad to have his knowledge, his expertise, and his research here to give us some insights into that. So with that, over to you, Reggie, and thank you.
Hi, Anita, and thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for participating on today's call to discuss this very important topic. As Anita mentioned, my name is Reggie Smith, and I cover our clean energy investments at Eventide Asset Management. As a quick disclaimer, what I say should not be taken as investment advice, and Eventide does not hold solar supply chain companies with forced labor. Now, as a values-based firm, we strive to honor God and serve our clients by investing in companies that create compelling value for the global common good. And in pursuing the global common good, we recognize the potential of renewable energy, its benefits to society broadly, and ability to contribute to human flourishing. And so for us, it's an important theme to pursue. Now, I want to take you quickly through our journey in approaching this issue, and then some important takeaways that we think investors should consider as they approach this issue. So we started looking into this about a half a year ago, and we really wanted to understand the scope of the problem. And the work Laura and Narola just took us through in that sample is really the best we've seen, and it's truly incredible what they've done. We needed to understand the impact this would have on our investment strategy, and then importantly, what engagement action we could take with companies potentially impacted by this. So when we first began engaging the industry, we found that many leaders within companies were not aware of the extent of the crisis and the level of atrocities being committed against the Uyghur people. So we wanted to educate the market. Now, everyone is more aware, but there's still more to go in creating that education and awareness. We also found that it was important to, and we really wanted to do this, appeal to people's hearts. This is not an easy issue to even talk about at times when you dig into the level of atrocities and what is actually happening. It's unconscionable, but we needed to talk about that to really appeal to the emotions and the fact that this is actually impacting real people's lives. We're not just talking about business or something just that is, you know, out there, but not, you know, not actually, you know, really having a terrible impact, right? And so we wanted to bring it to life. Our engagements and research culminated in a report, And this report will be published hopefully sometime this week. It is primarily for executives at solar companies or investors. And we really lay out three things. So one, how forced labor is being integrated in the solar supply chain, which we've sort of touched on in this webinar. And then contextually, the massive scheme of oppression being implemented in China. And this is the part that I was saying we want to appeal to people in terms of creating the larger narrative here, meaning it's not a one-off random act of forced labor, right? There is a concerted effort to oppress these people. And importantly, it describes an action plan for solar energy buyers to consider in how they can participate in pushing forced labor out of the supply chain. So so that's our general approach. That's what we're doing. And now I want to talk through some high level concepts that we're thinking about and that we think need to be brought to the forefront. So first, traceability. Laura touched on this, and we think it's an important first step because it can potentially ensure that any products that arrive, for example, on US shores, are not touched by forced labor directly. So at a product level, it can ensure that. So if you think about the making of a solar panel, you have a wafer making step where it's actually the ingot and wafer making step where you take the polysilicon in. And a company in China, for example, could be buying from 3 different polysilicon makers. And if one of them uses forced labor, like GCL Poly does, then everything they make is potentially tainted, because we think most of the time, or there is at least the possibility at any given time, that polysilicon from various sources is mixed together. And so what traceability does is it separates this out so that we're no longer going to put the GCL Poly in the general production process, but have a separate production process for that source of polysilicon, and then keep the other 2 sources that are free from forced labor separate, right? And so you could potentially then create cells and modules with 2 separate streams now of wafer product. All right. And so that's the goal of traceability. Now it's a if, and it's a big if, you can get traceability back into these regions of China, like Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. But that's what would be required in using the existing supply chain while relying on traceability to get this product. Now, here's the important part. And this is what we want to communicate, if nothing else that you remember from what I've said. If you get good traceability, you end up with what's called a bifurcated supply chain. And even if you don't get traceability, you end up with a bifurcated supply chain. And I'll explain how. So first, what is the bifurcated supply chain? So going back to a company, just a solar module company, they would then take wafers and product downstream of that and make solar panels, cells and modules. And they would have pure supply, quote unquote pure, because it wouldn't be directly touched by forced labor. And they would have that supply chain, for example, to feed maybe the United States or European markets or any other countries that are sensitive to forced labor. But they would continue to procure from raw materials to wafers, doesn't matter, material that is impacted by forced labor in Xinjiang, okay? And so we're actually seeing this. Jinko Solar built partially because of traceability issues. And this is what I said, even if you don't get traceability, you still end up with this. They're building a 7 gigawatt ingot and wafer factory in Vietnam. It's supposed to come online next year. They want to bring in polysilicon from presumably Wacker Chemie out of Germany and create that supply to then feed the US. But are they still operating in Xinjiang? That is still going on. Are they still buying polysilicon from players in Xinjiang to feed other markets? That is expected to still be going on. We haven't heard any changes there. So this is the bifurcated supply chain where you have a company still participating, even though they might be able to produce product that technically was not touched by forced labor, but the company itself is still involved in the atrocities. And so we think that this concern has to get put out there. It is not acceptable. And why is this a problem? I mean, quite simply because the Uyghur people continue to be oppressed, and solar energy buyers, CEOs at companies, US companies, continue to do business with suppliers involved in that oppression. So they're continuing to contribute to the profitability of companies involved in some way in this oppression, and that is not acceptable. So our main message here, you can go to the next one, is this long-term solution. And it's, sourcing from companies that don't use forced labor directly or in their supply chains for any of their products. And that's the key, any of their products. And so what we're looking to do in our engagement is get alignment from company leaders that this is what they're after, this is what they want, and then see action with a deadline. And so that's what we're pushing for. And so in closing, as values-based investors, we find in certain situations, we can use our ownership stake to engage with companies and create awareness, push for industry level change. And this is definitely one of those opportunities. And historically, I want to mention, we could consider apartheid in South Africa and the work of Leon Sullivan and others who demanded corporations participate in change. Institutional investors demanded corporations adopt the Sullivan principles or don't do business in South Africa. And of course, apartheid eventually fell. And so the work that we do as investors matters, and we can bring about a better world. And so we want to be a resource to the industry. We'll be publishing this report, and we're happy to continue the conversation with stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Reggie. I mean, that was really great. I mean, really getting into understanding as an investor, the solar industry, the bifurcation, and exactly what you say. We must be sourcing from companies that do not use forced labor, period. The bifurcation is a key point, and investors like you are leading the way, and that's great. And we want to continue this conversation with the other investors on the line. So with that, I'll ask the Laura and Narola to turn on their cameras. You can turn off the slide deck for the minute, Juliet. And I'm also going to invite Ashley Owens, who's a senior advisor with Shift, which is the leading center of expertise on the UN Guiding Principles. In her role as financial institution lead, she coordinates Shift's work with private commercial banks, development finance institutions, and institutional investors. This year, Shift launched a space for leading practitioners in the finance space to really discuss human rights challenges. And so, we'll hear from Ashley as well later, a little bit more of insights into a conversation that we hope to have with our panelists about, what really are we going to be looking forward as investors and as business communities who want to see the change to renewable energy moving forward. But with that, let's really start to get some questions. I'm going to start with a question from Sarah, and who has put a couple of questions in the question and answer box, but I'm going to get her to ask the question directly. So Sarah, I've unmuted you, so you might need to unmute yourself, and please go ahead.
Oh, yes, it's me, right? Okay.
Right,
I didn't expect it.
Yes. Just introduce yourself and tell us which organization you're from as well.
Yes, so my name is Sarah Kuch, and I am working as a corporate of shareholder engagement and advocacy at SHARE. So SHARE is a Canadian organization that represents institutional investors, and they represent approximately 95 Canadian dollars, $1 billion of asset under management. And we're currently working on our engagement plan to incorporate more concerns around the just or unjust transition and how we can make a direct impact. And obviously, this human rights concern seems to play a big role in it. But there is, I'm not a specialist, right? So there's a lot of things that I'm not sure to grasp quite correctly. For instance, I haven't read your answers, but for the second question, I was wondering, like, from my understanding, 45% of polysilicon is sourced in the Xinjiang and 30% is outside, but in China. So is there a risk that if we ask companies to move out of the Xinjiang, there will be a transfer from the CCP to go around this, I don't know, this move? Like if many companies request that. And if it happens, I mean, China is big, and even in the Xinjiang, it's very complicated to detect these facilities. So, like, is there an alternative? And should we, for example, request companies to move outside China in general? And if so, is it even possible considering the very small proportion of raw material sourcing outside the country?
I'm going to give this to Laura and Reggie. Please, Laura, please answer, and Reggie, please, chime in.
Yeah, what we're seeing now is a lot of companies expanding their capacity outside of the Xinjiang region, so in Inner Mongolia, in Yunnan, but also in Malaysia. And there is a concern that they will nonetheless be sourcing from Xinjiang. And I think that what a lot of the companies that are attempting to, like consulting firms that are attempting to help solar module manufacturers and contractors to pull out of Xinjiang, what they're having trouble doing is being able to confirm for sure that if you buy your polysilicon from Yunnan, that it's not blended with polysilicon from Xinjiang, or that the metallurgical grade silicon isn't being sourced from Xinjiang, as Reggie was talking about. And so I think what they're trying to do right now is figure out how to best determine the origins, the provenance of the individual ingredients that go into those products. There are a lot of different ideas for how to do that. Some of it has to do with receipt balancing. Some of it has to do with possibly technology that would, or even just sort of spreadsheets that would identify purity that comes from certain companies. But I will say this, it's not as complicated as, say, apparel. So if you're interested, or if you've thought about the same issue in apparel, you can have a factory making this shirt, and it can be totally clean and totally perfect, and everything can be kosher, and you can have inspectors come in and look at that factory, but actually be making this shirt for the most part in a shadow factory down the street. A polysilicon factory is far too expensive to create, a shadow factory of. What they're seeing is what they're getting in many ways. And the supply chains are pretty well established and very fairly public because purity is such an issue. And so there are a lot of things that are in the favor of being able to create a situation of real transparency in the polysilicon industry that I think is harder in some others. Reggie, you might have some other thoughts on that.
And Reggie as well, there's another question for you once you chime in on that, where someone's asked that, given your firm's policy, have you been able to invest in any part of the solar panel supply chain, recognizing that solar is a critical part of the global energy transition? So just, if you can hit those two questions, that would be grand. Thanks.
Sure. So on the supply chain issue, so there's two, from a high level. You can have companies outside of China that build a supply chain, sort of soup to nuts, to build a solar panel, and they procure, they completely avoid Xinjiang. Or you could have companies in China that change or can verify that they are no longer sourcing, if they were, from Xinjiang. So if we take the second thing that I mentioned, so within China, company within China, they could potentially procure from regions stop procuring from Xinjiang, procure from outside of China, and produce, materials along the supply chain, maybe up until the wafer step, for example. And so that's what we would like to see, some good action there. And that would release quite a bit of supply to the world that avoids this situation. Now, for companies outside of China, maybe someone like Hanwha Q-Cells or something that is, a Korean company, could be involved in building a supply chain completely outside of China, from soup to nuts, and of course have no procurement from Xinjiang. So that is the piece there. So there are opportunities for solutions, but they're difficult because of the extent of production that comes from the region. Now, in terms of no, the short answer is no, we have not been able to invest in the solar supply chain companies, because of this issue.
Thanks for that. I'm going to the next question, and I'd also invite Ashley, to participate. Ashley, if you, no, so it's great, because I think from here we'll really just kind of, I think based on the questions that are coming, we're already kind of segueing into, what are really the options that we can think about as we're trying to reimagine what the solar sector will look like. We're all really very much wanting to invest in renewable energy. This is not a sector we're getting out of. So how do we do this in a just way? But before we just start that conversation, I'm going to pose one more question. This is from Mary Beth Gallagher from Domini Impact Investment. How do you see the response in this sector compared with that of other industries? For example, we filed a shareholder proposal with Nike. The AGM is on the 6th of October, in which we asked for a human rights impact assessment of their cotton supply chain, which is, suspected to be tainted with forced labor. Is auditing and monitoring effective for confirming they have left the region? So I'm happy to throw it out there. I'm happy to take this as well. But Laura, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Ashley, feel free to jump in as well. Great, thanks.
Mary Beth, thank you for that question. And I think that there are a couple of questions in there. In terms of the comparison, I don't think it's I'm not able to hide that I'm a bit disappointed in the stepping back of the solar energy industry's stance on pulling out of Xinjiang. And yet I have to say that, they came forward. They are trying to figure out what to do. They have begun tracing. They're explicit in their saying that what's happening in Xinjiang is forced labor, which is not what we're seeing in the apparel industry. There's a lot of, there are a couple of companies that are willing to come out, and then they get dinged on the China side and they get in trouble and they step back. But for the most part, the apparel industry is being much more reticent and potentially, for good reason, because of course, when we're talking about the apparel industry, they have a problem of forced labor within Xinjiang, and they have a problem of forced labor throughout China, of forced labor of Uyghur people being transferred across the rest of China. We found no evidence of that happening in the solar supply chain, of Uyghurs being transferred to other parts of China to work in Yunnan or in Inner Mongolia. And we don't suspect that's happening in part because of the technological requirements of the jobs that they would be willing to transfer people for the polysilicon industry. And so it's a little bit different. But in terms of auditing and monitoring, this is partially what I was getting at before, that it is quite difficult to get clear answers on the provenance of any goods in China, now in particular because of the China anti-sanctions law that makes it so that companies and individuals and even auditing firms are not really supposed to comply with these sanctions against Chinese products, in particular those that made in the Xinjiang region. And so if companies can't talk about pulling out of Xinjiang, then it's hard for them to say, don't worry, we've pulled out. So I think that auditors are having a very hard time determining how to best get at ensuring that your products are not being made in that region.
I want to also add something about this auditing. And to knowing, are they really pulled out from there, or to look at or examine the factory or the company has been involved forced labor, you have to have a condition that you can talk to the Uyghur worker or Kazakh worker there. None of them can tell the truth, because what happening in Xinjiang is there's whoever speak the truth, the dire consequences waiting for them are sent into the internment camp. So it's impossible you will get the real answer from from the Uyghur region.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, we've basically, based on all the expert reports, we've really come to the conclusion that any kind of auditing or verification in the Xinjiang region, due to the extent of mass surveillance there, is clearly impossible. And the presumption is that anything coming from the Uyghur region is tainted by forced labor. And that's as well the basis of the WROs that the US authorities have put in place. But I'm going to try and, in answering some of the questions that have been asked, sort of shift the conversation a little bit into, like you said, I mean, we're in this situation. We do want to continue investing in renewable energy sector. The existential threat of climate change is not something that we're saying we need to just kind of put a pause on. So what can we do as an investment community? What can we do as financial actors to really think about that? Maybe I'll throw it out to Ashley to kick us off on this, and then Reggie, feel free to chime in.
Sure, absolutely. So much to say on what's been said. Really appreciated the presentations that have come before me, and just to really, I guess in answering that question directly, Anita, to focus on this concept of the just transition, and shift. So as Anita mentioned, we're a nonprofit. We do work with financial institutions and with companies looking at this issue in particular, and the way that we have found, particularly within, I think, private commercial banks and others, that there's been traction internally with this issue is situating it very much within this idea of the just transition, and looking at the halo effect that renewables have enjoyed for so long because of the very important environmental positive considerations. But it's what this has done, again, has really highlighted the neglect of the S in ESG. And the fact that, we haven't developed sophisticated metrics and tools to be looking at the S as much as we would like, and have allowed sort of, this issue to get to the extent that it has. We've heard a lot from the other panelists about this point in time where we're making decisions about divestment. And Anita, you've mentioned this concept of collective leverage. And what I wanted to do was just give a little bit of an overview of how we situate that within the guiding principles on business and human rights, which gives us that roadmap and that framework to be looking at this. Before I say a little bit about collective leverage specifically. And I think here, of course, we have to start with the presumption that anything that's being manufactured, any activities that are taking place within Xinjiang, as Anita mentioned, are tainted with forced labor. And so when we have companies that are looking at this from a GP's perspective and saying, are we connected to harm? If we have a connection into Xinjiang, then we are going to be starting with a rebuttable presumption. We're following the activities. And so when we're tracing our supply chain, we're looking at whether, the components, whether the modules, whether the raw materials within our supply chain are connected in any way to Xinjiang. But of course, as Reggie pointed out so well, that does allow us to lead to sort of a bifurcated supply chain. And we do want to avoid that for ethical reasons very clearly. And it's also a question of how much we can really trust that bifurcated supply chain, right? If we have already an organization that has, potentially a connection to serious forced labor, are we confident, that bifurcation is in fact even something that can be trusted? When you look at the way the guiding principles, dictates that we think about connections to harm of this kind, we're really what we're looking at is the question of leverage. Do the solar companies with which we are engaging, do we as investors, do we have leverage to affect this situation in a positive way? And what we come to very quickly, and was highlighted so well by the presentations by Laura and Nirola, was that we're very unlikely to have that leverage as when it comes to activities that are taking place in Xinjiang. This is state-directed forced labor. And so we move very quickly through what we call a leverage decision tree, where we say, do we have the leverage to change the situation for the better for people? And if we don't, can we build it? Can we increase it? And of course, one of the ways in which we can increase our leverage is to try to work collectively. And that's what Anita mentioned earlier. even still, it's very, very hard in this situation to think about how a group of solar companies or a group of responsible investors can really make that change to change, CCP policy within Xinjiang, considering how this is the hub of the Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, et cetera. So we are continuing to be invested, or we're continuing to be engaged as we're considering, ways in which to disengage, essentially. And I think, one of the things that the roles that financial institutions have to play is to look at how we can incentivize, create these kind of markets, not passive as financial institutions in this context. We know that there is, we look at the apparel context, we know there's a 10-year on setting up, analogous and spinning, kind of proximate ginning and spinning facilities overseas. From Reggie about, the kind of establishment of solar facilities elsewhere, but this takes time. And so what we really do is encourage financial institutions, not to be passive players, and to be observers and sort of aligning scores, etc., but to consider what the active role is. And we are at Shift working, for example, one financial institution who is actively seeking to have conversations with other financial institutions about to incentivize and encourage the alternative markets, while of course at the same time best-in-class transactional due diligence informed by the brilliant research that Laura and Nirola are coming up with, but at the same time making sure that we are looking, as Anita says, at that longer term picture. What can we do? And that is part of our leverage, and that is the only way sort of we can justify staying engaged in the shorter term. And we have to have that eye to the longer term.
Great, no, thank you. Reggie, yes, please.
Ashley, I think those are great thoughts, and I want to maybe add three things. So one, the way we're thinking about it, and that how we think and approach, to consider could come together is a phased approach, and we put an 18-month timeline on it. And essentially what we do is we put ourselves in the driver's seat of a large renewable energy buyer in the US and say, how can they push forced labor down and out of the supply chain? So first, in the first phase, in the first 6 months, they should stop buying panels from module makers that directly use forced labor. Right, and then in the second phase, they should stop buying panels from those that, from module makers that procure polysilicon from polysilicon providers that directly use forced labor. And then in the third phase, they shouldn't buy from module makers that get their raw materials from raw material providers that directly use forced labor. Right, and so over 18 months. Now, why 18 months? That's roughly the amount of time it takes to make wafer capacity. Wafer capacity is the big bottleneck. So roughly 97% of it comes from China. And so how can we verify, that the mixing isn't occurring and everything downstream, right, isn't tainted? So we need new wafer capacity outside of China. And we have enough polysilicon with some minor adjustments to feed at least the US market. Okay, so if we can get that polysilicon to good wafer capacity, free of this issue completely, then we're in business. So then as investors, we think it's important to be looking for those opportunities, investment opportunities, to creating the wafer capacity, et cetera, right? And importantly, supporting companies, these renewable energy buyers that are aligned with wanting to create this 100% forced labor free supply chain. So let's put our capital towards those companies that are aligned with this vision and support them.
Great, Reggie. Yeah, Ashley and Laura and Nirola, please just jump into the conversation, please.
I just wanted to sort of, just really recognize the work that Reggie's doing and to say, that as part of the work we're doing, we're speaking to, financial institutions across, DFIs, across investors, ECAs, banks, et cetera. And, the approach that Reggie is outlined, is up there with the most thoughtful. One of the things we are hearing about, of course, is this sort of back to the old conflict mineral style sort of, guarantees where we're hearing, we're asking people to sort of commit to not having any forced labor or verify that they don't have any forced labor. And what's been interesting is that, in rare cases, the most sophisticated of the companies are actually coming back and saying, well, that's impossible for us to do. And that's a really brave statement to make, but it reflects, the reality as Laura and Nirola have laid it out, right? And we are definitely seeing parallels with conflict minerals, with apparel. There are lessons that we can learn from that, as we sort of say, this is a systemic issue, and it's not one that's going to be solved by asking people to sign necessarily just a guarantee, but there has to be that work around that as well. So to really acknowledge that.
Laura, unmute yourself. Yeah, sure.
I'd like to say some positive things too about what I think the likelihood of this being an effective effort are. So for one, I've seen questions that are responding to the things that Reggie and Ashley are saying about, whether we should engage particular companies in China when we know that they're deeply invested in Xinjiang, whether we think that that this is a much bigger problem, and the answer is yes, of course it is. That is about the Chinese government in general, and whether there's any way we can ever have any leverage when the Chinese government is so powerful, and when this is a massive system of forced labor with an enormous investment on the part of the government. And it's hard to even imagine what the end game would be for them if they decided, well, we don't want to even have the internment camps anymore. It's hard to imagine this ever ending in some ways. But one thing on my darkest days that my therapist reminds me is that all bad things change at some point. But this is a thing that I've also seen progress over the last 4 years since we've been working on this issue, 5 years now. And that is that while charges of human rights violations have not had a whole lot of effect on the way the Chinese government is treating the Uyghur people, economic leverage has. And we have seen people be released from the camps in somewhat large numbers. There's also been political leverage. So the Kazakh government put pressure on the Chinese government early on and got a lot of Kazakh people out. But there's also this economic leverage is not just like directly changing the way the Chinese government acts, but it's changing the way companies act. Companies are taking risks on the ground in defying these programs, or announcing that they're no longer participating in poverty alleviation and labor transfer programs, even if it's just lip service for now. The first step to doing what I want you to do is to say what I want you to do, but to make me feel better, whatever reason. But what we're seeing is that companies are taking enormous hits. Huafu lost like $54 million in sales last year, and companies are coming out and actively pursuing ways to show that they're not engaged in forced labor. And that is having an effect on the Chinese government as well. So I do think that our investments and our work in this arena, in the economic arena, has the most likely chance of having an effect on the actual day-to-day lives of Uyghur people. We won't see it happen overnight. We won't convince Jinko to suddenly just feed everyone and make free everyone from a camp or anything like that. But we can put pressure on Jinko or other companies like Jinko because they have such huge investments in the United States, and they know that they have to keep those investments alive. They know that they need that market share, and so we do have the room to put pressure on companies outside of China, to put pressure on companies within China, and to, in effect, have pressure on the Chinese government to change the way they're treating Uyghur people. It's slow. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint, but it is absolutely worth it.
No, thank you so much. And that sort of, helps to take me to just, as investors, as we've been talking about, we actually have to be quite creative about the way we need to create leverage in this particular situation. It's not the usual forced labor situation, as we've discussed. So we do have to be quite creative about it. We have to find ways in which we can come together as an investment group to increase our leverage, work with other stakeholders. Laura mentioned a couple of ideas. All the panelists actually mentioned different ideas about how we can do that. And the Investor Alliance, together with ICCR, is really working with investors. We currently have a group of 66 investors that have come together to collectively talk about how they can address forced labor in their supply chains, and also as well concerns about mass surveillance and the sale of technology with technology companies. So we would invite investors to really reach out to us to be part of this investor group to discuss ways in which we need to engage with our companies as we go through the process of doing our own human rights due diligence, which starts with engagement, starts with mapping out supply chains, starts with research and understanding what's going on in the environment. It also means that we need to partner with maybe stakeholders that we're not accustomed to partnering with. We need to push for industry responses, not individual responses, which allows China easy pickings for backlash, but as an industry response on what we want the industry as leaders to say, no forced labor in our supply chains. I also see, and I just wanted to call this out, that the solar supply chain or the solar companies that we're investing in, many of us invest in, do not have a consumer market in China, which is a little bit different from the apparel sector, where a lot of their market, while they buy from China or they source from China or the Xinjiang region, they also have a consumer market, and hence there's a tough balance to play, and they are really within a rock and a hard place. The solar industry is going to be a little bit different from there without having that consumer market as a backlash. So I think as investors, we really want to come together and discuss how do we want to then use that difference in this industry, right, in this sector, to how we want to push and approach our companies that we invest in. I think we should continue to engage with Chinese companies, but we might not be able to make that kind of progress, but we definitely should still engage with them. And with that, really, again, invite all of you to reach out to, to myself, to reach out to the Investor Alliance, to reach out to any of the experts on this call. And I need to wrap up now, and I wanted to thank all of you for your great input to this discussion. Nairola for setting us out and sharing with us some of your personal stories, which is, I know, heart-wrenching, and our support goes out to the Uyghur people, and to Laura, Reggie, Ashley, and again, Nairola for their professional work that they have dedicated to really trying to understand the sector, and to all the investors who have jumped on the call. So thank you very much. We're two minutes over, and I look forward to further conversations. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye for now.